I've been working on this novel for a very, very long time. Too long. A few days ago, a friend of mine texted me and congratulated me and reminded me that in 2006, while I was editing her film, I said, I want to be a published author, and I have an idea for a book. And when she told me, and I remembered this, I thought, I've been working on this since the Bush administration. And it really has. I mean, it's actually even longer than that. But that's what it took to do it right. And I'm glad that it did. And many people here this evening were instrumental in my being able to do this. So I thank you for everything over the years. So I'm going to read you a chapter called Tea and Sunset. And, I should probably tell you the setup. Basically, the main story takes place on an orchard in Nishapur, Iran, in the lead up to the revolution in 1979. And the first sort of movement in the book that takes place in Iran is a Friday lunch on this orchard. The excerpt I'm going to read for you is from the end of this lunch, which is after the siesta. So it's tea and then the sunset. The post-siesta tea always began as a nebulous affair with everyone still groggy with sleep. The men gathered outside the house by the tea service and fruit, which Mirza had set up for them. The women gathered in Bibi Khanum's room to take their tea, oohing and awing over her winter sewing projects. This time, she brought out a stack of mittens she had crocheted for skin exfoliation called leaves. Most of the leaves were natural white, save for the baby blue with red flowers. That Bibi Khanum handed to the midwife. Qamar and Nasreen tried on the others for size. Next, she spread out the brightly colored chadors she had sewn. Qamar and the midwife inspected the various flower print fabrics in blue, pink, and white, while Nasreen looked on with disinterest. Qamar held one out to her daughter as she spoke. "You don't want one?" "I don't need one." "But you used to love mine. I always had to go get them from your room." "It was fun for playtime. I wore them as floor-length dresses, not draped over my head." "Nasreen, watch your mouth. This is not a joke." Bibi Khanum jumped in. "Now come. It's just a piece of cloth. How you wear it is how it is defined. For Nasreen, it's a dress, and for us, it's a tradition. To each her own." Qamar stared at Nasreen as if to say, "Wait until we get home." To change the mood, Bibi Khanum brought out her jewelry box. She opened it for the ladies. Whichever piece a woman seemed to notice with intensity, she offered as a gift. At first, the woman modestly refused. Then, at Bibi Khanum's insistence, she gleefully accepted. Much to everyone's surprise, the midwife took a jewel-encrusted bobby pin. She pulled her chador off her head, revealing a shock of bright orange hennaed hair with inch-long, brighter white roots. She looked like a sunflower. She swept her hair to one side of her brown face and stuck the pin in, then admired herself in the handheld mirror. Qamar took a gold chain from which hung a teardrop-shaped piece of turquoise. She opened the clasp and tried to close it around her neck, but the necklace was too short. She huffed and pouted until Bibi Khanum dug out a longer gold chain from the box and transferred the turquoise teardrop to it. Nasreen sat back and watched. Only she had noticed that each spring Bibi Khanum gave away another piece of her material life. Her gold bangles she had given to Nasreen one by one. Today, Bibi Khanum pulled off the last 3 remaining and pushed them onto the young woman's arm. Nasreen looked up, at her in disbelief, but Bibi Khanum smiled at her and quietly said, "It's all right. They're all yours now. I am far too old to make so much noise. It is your time now." On the deck, the men took their customary positions on the floor pillows. Each poured his tea into the saucer to cool it. The mullah motioned to Mirza to bring some dates. When Mirza returned, bending down to set them in front of the mullah, the cleric caught a whiff of his breath and his face reddened. "Go wash out your mouth." Mirza put his hand over his mouth and hurried into the kitchen, unaware that the scent of wine lingered on his breath. He stood at the sink and took handfuls of water into his mouth and gargled. Outside, the mullah launched into the morality tale of why alcohol was forbidden to Muslims, how drunkenness made one forgetful of God and prayer. He cursed the bars and liquor stores that had opened for business over the past several years, selling the forbidden liquids with impunity. He went on and on about the evils of intoxicants, eventually moving on to the perils of games of chance. "If a man does not stand by his principles," he said, "he cannot call himself a man." From there, he somehow found a way to work Imam Hussein into the speech, which was a gift that all clerics seemed to possess. There was not a subject in the world that did not somehow relate to Imam Hussein. Majid was not surprised by the mullah's reaction. He knew this Islamic stricture on drinking. Even though under the present regime there was no law against alcohol, it was still frowned upon. What did strike him was that the mullah chose to make his point by humiliating a man who was clearly his subordinate. He leaned into the judge, who sat motionless listening to his brother go on, almost longing for a cold shot of vodka as a reprieve from all the righteousness. "If a man degrades his fellow man," he whispered, "he cannot call himself principled." This drew a smile from the judge's face, but the mullah kept going. His eyes were half closed, and he was completely unaware that all three men in front of him were drinkers. None suffered more from the mullah's sermon than Shazdapur. Shazdapur despised his uncle's faith as much as he loved cognac. Majid noticed him looking his way and slightly raised his hand as if to say, "To your health." Shazdapur was so tickled to be included in the conspiracy that he giggled aloud. The cleric fell silent and looked right at him. "You think a child dying of thirst in the desert is funny?" Shazdapur froze. He had laughed exactly at the moment in the mullah's story where Imam Hussein's baby boy was dying of thirst. Majid leapt to his father's defense. "Haj Agha, this story is so terribly sad." Father was stifling a sob, not laughing. Shazdapur put his hand to his forehead for good dramatic measure. The mullah eyed him and, once satisfied, went back to his sermon. So I'm going to skip a little bit ahead. The sun was growing dim, the final chapter of Friday lunch. The women came out of Bibi Khanum's room, breaking up the mullah's sermon. One by one, the guests expressed their gratitude to their hostess, said their farewell, and started up the path to home. The mullah led the way, then Qamar, grumbling under her breath about an upset stomach brought on by too much food. Her husband followed a half step behind, and then Nasrin, holding the midwife's arm. Majid walked at the end of this line, admiring Nasrin's effortless gait while feigning interest in conversation with his father. Shazdapur had suspected that there was something between the two young people, and now he was certain. He looked at the space between the young lovers and could almost feel the love between them, and he thought, in that moment, that if they were to metamorphose into musical tempos, she would be allegro ma non troppo to his grave con brio. Shazdapur hummed along, batting stones out of his way with his mahogany walking stick. The mullah beckoned him to the head of the line. Shazdapur picked up his pace. Did you know that every 33 years the lunar and solar calendars overlap? Said the mullah. The mysteries of the cosmos. There will be a full solar eclipse as well, I have heard. The mullah looked sternly at his nephew. It is not a mystery. It's a war. Chaharshanbe Suri falls on the same day as Ashura. If I catch one person celebrating that pagan ritual when they should be mourning, they will have to answer for it. Shazdapur did not believe that the Zoroastrian fire-jumping ritual was an affront to the day that Imam Hussein was killed in the Battle of Karbala. Zoroastrian rituals from Chaharshanbe Suri to Nowruz were so much a part of the culture that they were celebrated by all Iranians regardless of their religion. Shazdapur hated Ashura, though. He hated anything related to Shiite Islam. Every year during Ashura, he would hide in his salon and drink his cognac while the weeping processions of people beating themselves passed by outside his door. For him, the great tragedy of Iran had been the arrival of Islam. For him, its infiltration into the everyday life of the people was a descent into the Dark Ages, the public demonstrations of grief for, as he once put it after one too many cognacs, an Arab who died in the middle of the desert 1,300 years ago on his way to seize power, was the lowest a nation could stoop. And to add insult to this injury was to be told to submit 3 times a day to this contrived narrative in Arabic, a foreign tongue which was, for him, the end of Persian civilization. He turned to the mullah and said, I am sure people will be respectful of the serious and unique nature of the overlapping of the calendars. Things are changing, and people will have to start answering for their indiscretions. Shazdapur knew full well what the mullah was alluding to. He spent every evening in his salon listening to the BBC. The rumblings of unrest in the cities were growing stronger and stronger. It was just a matter of time before it ruptured the ground beneath his feet. No matter how quietly and elegantly he sat in his club chair trying to drown it out with adagios, andantes, and allegros. Golden hour descended upon the orchard, and the sun bowed in long shadows cueing the moon. The insect chorus raised their evensong to praise her ascent, then sank into soft vespers under her gaze. Bismillahir-Rahmanir-Rahim, Bibi Khanum whispered, with her eyes closed, standing on a small carpet with nothing but a prayer stone from Karbala. She knelt and bent to this stone and touched it with her forehead, where a small mark had formed from years of prostration. After a few lines of prayer, she raised her palms to the sky, then knelt again and put her head to the stone. The words she whispered were spoken by rote in Arabic, a language foreign to her, but whose strictures allowed her to enter a space where she was alone in the presence of God. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Words as a means for invocation. She repeated the same gesture several times, and when she was done, she folded her prayer rug and put it away. Mirza had finished his work in the kitchen and walked back to his shack with his kerosene lamp, the sound of the gravel beneath his feet. Marsh frogs rhythmically croaked and chirped their mating calls along the streams. Eagle owls hooted in the trees before taking off on their silent hunt. Mirza sat down on his carpet, the glow of the kerosene lamp enlivening the room. He flipped back the edge of the carpet and took out a photograph hidden beneath it. It was of a smiling woman and a small boy no more than 10 years of age, his wife and son. The two were killed in a market square bombing one sunny afternoon during the family's shopping excursion in his Afghan hometown. He had just called out to his wife to come smell the cherries he had purchased for her to make jam with, when a car rammed into the kiosk where she was standing with their son and exploded. Stunned into silence, a piece of shrapnel lodged just underneath his left eye, he began to walk with only the bag of cherries in his hand until he reached home. There he collected a small satchel and kept walking until he crossed the border, resting in the byroads and on highways along the route. By the time he reached the town square in Nishapur, the cherries had rotted and the shrapnel had formed a bluish cataract in his left eye. Before, he had been a Farsiwan medical doctor from Herat who went by his given name, Muhammad Ali Khan. Now he was Mirza, who cooked and cleaned in the orchard. He had come to his work only by walking through the open doors. There, under his tree, sat the judge. He sat next to him. They did not speak for an hour except for the offering of tea. After taking tea, he had turned to the judge and asked if there was work to be done, and he had remained there ever since. He now lay on his carpet, staring at the photograph. He leaned it against the lamp and spoke to it in hushed tones about his day. He told his son how perfect the tahdig had turned out and the scolding Jafar had gotten for stealing the midwife's portion. He told his wife about the mullah and the wine and how ashamed he was to have been caught with it on his breath. Lowering his voice, he whispered to her about Nasreen and Majid's tryst among the trees and how it made him ache for her, as he always ached for her. After he was done, he kissed them both good night and put them back under the carpet. He blew out his lamp and lay down to sleep. In the moonlight, the judge sat under his tree. Bibi Khanum sat with her back to him. She pulled down her chador and handed him her hairbrush. He began to brush her hair, sometimes sweeping it off her neck and caressing her skin there, which still made her quiver. "You did so much today," he said. "You must be exhausted." "I'm fine. Mirza bears the brunt of the work. My brother embarrassed him about the wine. We call it medicinal juice." The judge laughed. "That's what you call the alcohol?" Bibi Khanum giggled and asked God for forgiveness by blurting out an astaghfirullah before saying, "Yes." She leaned into him and he put his arms around her. And as she sank into his embrace, you could not tell where one began and the other ended. Their laughter had died down and they sat together in the stillness and silence. They sat together in each other's presence in solitude. Sometimes passion is so quiet, you have to close your eyes to hear it. Let's see. Thank you. And so, please. Hello.
Oh, that's a lot of
Oh, this is me. And I think we have nameplates on our...
That was wonderful. Can you hear me?
Thank you. Can you hear us?
Yes.
Yes?
This is a little bit like sitting in someone's living room. It's so intimate, and I see so many faces I know, which makes me feel more comfortable. I just have to start by saying that I know Rabi for a very long time.
Yes.
And it's been really inspirational to see her transformation. I've known her as an actress, and then she made a film about Tazieh. She wrote many screenplays. She said she also was editing films. And most of all, she was always a storyteller. And we always enjoyed being around her because she's so funny. and to see all of these gifts culminate into a book, and that it's so rich, and it expresses so much about her personality, her life, her family, and have found her signature. It's really very moving for me, and I'm very proud of her. And aside from knowing her, I think this book is a very important book. And I say my own opinion. I think in many ways, of course, reminds me of how I set out as an artist, which was to be very honest about my personal angle and point of view about a country that I lost contact with for a lot of years. I think you were 8 when you left. And
8 years old, yeah.
Went back in 2002, the same for me, that the return and this obsession with my country was a way to reconnect with the family and with my origin. But I think, consequently, I think her work and mine has never been autobiographical, but to use your personal life experience in a way to give a glimpse into a culture that is so complex. And I think what is great about this book, it shows all the contradictions in the Iranian culture, that inside of family, outside and outside. And I think that the bridging of the personal plight and the collective plight of a country, it's the most accurate representation of Iranian people, I think. And I think every Iranian in this room, or anyone who will read this book, will understand that every one of us has a family that resembles this family in the way that the different generations are thinking in a different way, people who are weighed down by the gravity of tradition and the younger ones who are wanting to go forward. But more than anything, I think the political situation has divided us so profoundly. Even within families, we have people with completely different political views, and that has been devastating for many of us. Many of people have been torn apart, living in exile. Some have left still in Iran. We are very much conflicted about our identity as Iranian people, outside, inside, those who are religious, those who are not, those who are pro-monarchy, those who are not, and those who are inside of Iran sometimes dislike the Iranians outside of Iran, the economic differences. And I think, going back to this book, I feel that what it does is it really makes Iranian people identify with the story. I really think it resonates. But finally, I think, and I don't mean to dominate the conversation,
no, not at all. Go ahead.
I think at the end of every good work of art is the universality of the narrative, and hoping that people outside of your own culture would look at your work and be able to identify with the characters and the stories. And I think they will, because I think the humanity in this narrative and the fact that in every part of the world there are families that are torn apart according to political upheavals, but also due to existential issues. We have many people in the family that we don't completely relate to, and we're torn apart. And then I think finally, I think this other contradiction that I find beautiful in this, I think just what you just read, the tenderness, the affection, the love that exists within this family, but yet the distinctions, the differences, the brutality and hatred and animosity at the same time, that I think is not unique to Iranian people, but certainly it exists in us. And that very often Iranian people blame the governments for everything, for why we are being so divided and separated. But in reality, it's not just the governments, it's ourselves. Is that we are so deeply conflicted as human beings because of the circumstances that we have had to live with. Now, back to Rabi. I just want you to talk a little bit, again, yesterday when we met, I thought you said it so beautifully that the reason you went to writing is that you don't need a budget. You have a lot of freedom. You are the director, the set director, the set design. Talk a little bit about what it's like to see.
I had originally written this as a screenplay. And the story, the orchard was there, but the story was different. I know Shuja read it, It had some different characters. It was the time. It was like in the lead up to the revolution, and the orchard was there. And so I wrote this as a screenplay, and then trying to get a film made, is Herculean task. And as time went on, I just started to fidget with the screenplay, and I just started to change it into narrative.
But I'm sure a lot of people will read this book, have this very compelling question about how much of the story is inspired or based on your own personal family or people you know,
well,
or your experience of when you returned in 2002, and how much of it is research. And so, yeah.
Well, I think it's a combination of all of them. It's interesting. When I returned in 2002, it was after a 23-year absence. I had left Iran about 3 months before the revolution with my parents, and it was, in my eyes, everything was normal, and we were coming to be here for a short span of time because my father was an invited artist, and we were going to go back, and then we didn't. So, there was this feeling that life was suddenly cut. There was a cut that happened. It was like I went, it's like you get on a cruise ship and then it just like, you end up in the sea and then you're on this island and you're like, what just happened? I was going to go home in a week. So there was this kind of feeling.
But you often talk about how the orchard, Bibi Khanum's orchard.
The orchard is central to, the orchard is the real orchard from my own childhood. It was my paternal grandmother's orchard. And we used to go there every summer, all holidays. And, when as time went on, I think the reason that it started to have significance for me is because so much time had passed, but I always remembered the orchard. I forgot Tehran. I forgot all of the streets. I forgot all of these places in the city where we lived, but I remembered that orchard. So when I went back in 2002, and it was interesting because I actually was talking to Shirin about this. The night before I left for Iran, we were at dinner, and I remember we were on our way home, and you said to me, this trip will change your life. It will change your relationship to the work that you do. It's going to have a profound impact going forward. And I don't think I understood what you meant until I went, and I did. And when I went to Nishapur, my cousin, who I had not seen since I was a child, asked me if I want to go see what's left of the orchard. Because, my grandmother died soon after the revolution and the land was sold off piece by piece. So we drove up and there was this sort of piece of the adobe wall left, and we got out and we both just sort of stood in front of it, and I reached out my hand to touch it, and a chunk of it just fell into dust. And I think that was the moment. It didn't happen in terms of I knew in that moment I had to write a story and tell the story about this place, but that was the moment, I think, that was when I realized that everything dies, everything crumbles, and the only thing we have is really the stories we tell. So that was really the catalyst. But that's really where it ends in terms of, it's not autobiographical at all. In fact, one of the things I did when I started working on this as a novel and not as a screenplay is I removed any remnant of any person that could be me. I wanted to be completely in the background in a way. I wanted, that's real freedom for me, is to be able to sort of look at these other people and not think about my own life or my own experience or my own memories per se. Mm-hmm. I'm sure there's personal things in there, it's just I'm not aware of them.
But I think what I appreciate a lot about, you talk about the orchard as a metaphor of a nation, and the way that, for some of you who have read this book, the way that she structured the characters, that there's two main brothers. One is the judge, and the other is a mullah. And they have complete opposing views. One is sort of a religious fanatic, and the other, it's not interested in any of that.
He's
not intellectual either, but he's just sort of within this orchard where they all meet. And then there's the two other brothers, which is the sons of Shazdapur, Majid and Jamshid, one who is an idealist and wants a future and wants freedom and becomes an activist, and Jamshid, his brother, who is an opium addict and eventually becomes a thug. And then you have Bibi Khanum, who is this most tender, loving, very classic Iranian mother, and then you have Qamar Khanum, is this going to mean? So the way, talk a little bit about the way that you were building this characters in a way that it echoes elements of the Iranian society, that sort of pull between Persian identity and the sort of distaste for the Islamization of the country, and then the anti-Shah fervor, and then those who just wanted to have nothing to do with that and were fascinated by Europe, like.
Shazdapur, they call him Fokoli.
Right.
Yeah.
But I think it's quite amazing the way that, you structured your character. And can you just talk about that a little?
Well, I mean, when I was putting together the story, one thing I was very conscious of is that I wanted the members of this family to represent different aspects of Iranian society, because when you put them in a family, they have to deal with each other. So, it's not, so that gave me an opportunity to take all of, you don't choose the family you're born into. It's kind of like you don't choose the nation you're born into. And, so the idea of putting all of these characters that are so different from one another into one family allowed me to create that dramatic tension that's necessary in order to tell a story. But Shazdapur, the story is in a way structured, it takes place over the course of one day in Paris in 2012, and it's all almost like, reflections that he's having about what happened to his family. And so, even though he is someone that is very much, he hates aspects of the identity of the country. It's like you can't, I don't think it's possible to sort of look at Iran and take like 800 years of its history and sort of be like, I don't see that. Like, that's not there. So go on.
But I think it's great that you sort of maintain that balance. Nasreen and Majid go to Shiraz Festival, which I really appreciate if you read something brief in that chapter we talked about, which most Westerners are not aware, and that Shiraz Festival was this phenomenon whose Rabi's father, Rabeah Ghaffari, was very active in. Several people in this room during the Shah, that was really just completely avant-garde, and it was happening in Shiraz. And so you really give a glimpse into that kind of rich culture, and yet you take us into the streets of Tehran, Shiraz in terms of but also the political movements and the chaos in the country. But I think you really do maintain that balance, and I actually would really appreciate if you could just read that.
When they go to see Alice in Wonderland in Persepolis, that little section?
Just for those who are not familiar to that moment of Iranian history. What year was 1970?
The Festival of Arts was from 68 until 78. 67 until 78, yeah. And it was every year, no? And the festival, it took place in Shiraz and in Persepolis, and it was, this was the brainchild of the queen, no? This was her, because she was so involved in the arts, and this festival was, I think, one of the things.
I suppose it was people in television, like
in television, and
like
Reza Qutbi and that whole. So they had different. They had theater, music, symphonies, cinema, dance, and from all over the world. Like, I think like Robert Wilson came, Tadeusz Kantor, Jerzy Grotowski, and there was even jazz musicians. Like, there was people from all over the world. And in this part, actually, I used the Alice in Wonderland, which is Andre Gregory came with an American troupe. So this was real. They came to Shiraz and they did Alice in Wonderland. So if I can find it. Okay. So this is really, it focuses on Majid and Nasreen, who are sort of the young lovers in the book. To be cut loose in the heart of a city in the throes of a celebration was almost overwhelming to the young lovers. Without a word, they ran together down the street as though they were physically testing the boundaries of their new freedom. As the crowd swelled, Majid slowed his pace and took Nasreen's hand. They walked side by side. The sounds of actors and singers wove through the murmur of conversation, the calling of vendors. They sat together on a crate inside the fruit warehouse, watching the barefoot American troupe create a magical world of rabbits and mushrooms and disappearing cats. Drinks that made Alice shrink and cakes that made her grow. Alice was dressed in nothing more than patchwork rags, and yet she was fussy, spoiled, lost, the real Alice. They were mesmerized. Was it the play alone or their being together in public? Perhaps both. They held hands for every minute of the show. After the curtain call, they erupted into applause, clapping until their hands stung, Majid blowing whistles between claps. It was a cool night, and the scent of coals and kebab wafted through the air on the street. They sat at a plastic table outside a shack and ordered a platter to share, then washed it down with Coca-Colas. Nasreen was still electrified by the play they had seen. "Have you ever seen such a thing?" she said. "They were all so good. It was just so... Oh, Majid, wasn't it magic? Didn't you see the place, the animals, really see it?" "I did. I really did. They did it with nothing more than their bodies and voices, pure magic. I liked how they stepped into each role, then stepped out. Yes, and how they didn't use lighting tricks or costumes to transform themselves. This is what I long to do, Majid." Majid watched her face so full of passion. He thought of the train ride and the way in which she was able to sing a song, tell a story, or act out a scene, moving effortlessly from one character to the next with her whole body and voice. "You will do it. You already do." They finished their meal and headed back onto the main street, walking slowly now with Majid's arm around her shoulder. Nobody paid them any mind. Nobody cared that an unmarried couple so brazenly walked the streets, their bodies touching. It was nearing midnight when they arrived, and they made their way to the Hafeziyeh to listen to Persian music. The Hafeziyeh was the tomb of the poet Hafez and was surrounded by an open-air marble pavilion and lawns. A makeshift stage was set up in front of the tomb for a performance by 4 musicians, a sitar player, a dombak player, a kamanche player, and a singer who played the daf drum. People were scattered on the grass quietly conversing and hushed as soon as the music began. Majid lay on his side, resting his head on his hand, looking up at the moon. "There is a full solar eclipse coming next month," he said. "The moon will completely block out the sun." Nasreen brought her face over Majid's, blocking his view of the sky, and said, "Like this?" They laughed, then held still for a moment to mark the anticipation before a kiss. The music went on and on. People came and left. Shopkeepers pulled in their wares. Porters folded chairs and swept the stairs. Actors, directors, dancers, singers, dressed for a night out, gathered at restaurants and bars. Hotel lobbies hummed with guests. Street sweepers collected garbage, and street performers strapped their props to their backs. The show, at last, was over for the night. And just beyond, just out of sight of the newsstands and the hospitality kiosks, the makeshift stages, the concession stands, the restaurants, bars, and nightclubs, the journalists, paparazzi, press conferences, scholars, intellectuals, theater troupes, musicians, dancers, filmmakers, tourists, beyond the floodlights and the streetlights, in the vast darkness that spread across the plains, stood a nation on the brink of revolution.
We have just a few minutes before we open to question. I have a couple of very urgent questions from you. One of the issues, I work a lot in my films with history. A lot of my films, Women Without Men and Looking for Kulthum, have dealt with history and been period films. And I always am very interested in the way that through fiction you approach history and how the reinterpretation of history through fiction, along the way it could be that people would read the history the way it's depicted in fiction as actual history. And I'm just wondering your relationship to the moments like the films that I made. I've never lived in those 1953 or Kulthum film, but yet I allowed myself to do research and make the work. How do you feel about the way you approach history of time that you were not in Iran yourself? And I ask that because I think a lot of people would ask you that. And just talk about that a little bit.
You know, I tried my best to do the research that I needed to do. I spoke to people that were there. I tried to be as accurate as I could to a certain extent, though. This is a work of fiction, so I do take certain, poetic license, because it's more important that what happens, what you write, it makes sense for the character in that situation. But it's really strange. Like, I don't know, like, for example, the Amadeus was originally a play. And, and I think everyone's seen the film, and I think people would be shocked to know that that's not really the relationship that Mozart and Salieri had. But who cares? It's brilliant because, it's still, because it says something true. So I think I did try to be somewhat close to the truth of things, the best that I could. I don't think I'm too far off. And I think one of the ways in which you can do that is try to be sort of, I think as a novelist, you're not a propagandist. You're not there to prosecute a historical event, but to try to see it and understand it and see the human lives within it on all sides.
I mean, my experience has been, we made Women Without Men that took place in 1953 in Morocco. And we were not allowed, obviously, to work in Iran. And it was a book by Shahrnush Parsipur that we readapted with Shoja Azari, was here, into a film. But obviously, we shot in Casablanca, and they had palm trees and, things that in Iran, there was a rage that how could anyone make, that was the story also in Karaj, and we don't have palm trees. I said, give me a break. I'm an exile. I had no money and trying to tell the story of. So they were. It was just amazing the kind of details. Or like we had Moroccans. Of course, we dubbed them like the street protests, but they had slight Arabic accent, and the Iranian people were furious. So this was a kind of a nomadic way of making a period film. And then next was an Egyptian film that I made. Now I had the Arabs against me saying, oh, that's not the way it was. Now I really got in trouble because I didn't speak Arabic either. But I just find this incredibly courageous as people who are living in diaspora not in their own country, and like you, a generation that didn't even live most of those time that you are capturing, that you are able to depict it, and that you would give yourself the license to tell history, narrate history through fiction, which I think is more truthful than any kind of academic, in my opinion. There are many other questions I have, but I will stop like the issue of
but one thing to that is that sometimes I think the person that has the most distance can maybe see things better,
perhaps
in a certain way. You know, if you have a distance, I mean, you know, obviously there is an Iranian in the room tonight that wasn't in one way or another affected by the revolution. To some people lost everything. You know, some people lost their children, their parents, their sisters and brothers. I mean, so, you know, everybody's here because of the revolution. So, you know, it took me a long time to write this book because I took this very seriously. You know, you're talking about something that, and I think it's important that, you know, so what I mean is that even my whole life was turned upside down by this revolution. So it took me a long time to get to a place where I could tell this story and try to see these people in almost a dispassionate way, and try and not make it too much about, you know, this is right, this is wrong, so to speak.
The last tiny thing I want to say, I want to ask you, is the question of being a woman, being a woman narrator of a culture, of history. And this is not a feminist book. This is really deals with the gender issues very equally, which I really like. I don't do that. I just worry about the woman. But talk about, I mean, I think both in the way that you depict the woman of Iran, but also about being a woman artist. How does it make you feel to be that voice? That answers that.
I'm really enjoying being a woman. Well, I mean, look, it's, you know, it's a good time, I think, to be a woman writer. I mean, to be a woman artist, I think we're at a point where there's a lot that's opening up to us. And this is, you know, I mean, my editor and my agent, who are both here, are women. And, you know, and these are two people that were sort of instrumental in me getting this book out into the world. So, I mean, I have yet to, I'm sort of like that tortoise on Galapagos that hasn't had too much run-ins with, like, people, so they're not afraid. You know, so I don't know, maybe I'll get bruised in the process. I haven't gotten any terrible emails or death threats or anything yet. So.
No, but you would not. I think it's time for our wonderful patient audience to ask some questions. I don't know if there's microphones, but...
Yes, we have microphones, and because we're...
And feel free to ask questions even if you haven't read the book. I'm sure many of you haven't.
So, but wait for the microphone just because there are people watching online. They want to hear your question. So raise your hands.
Oh. There's one here.
Hi.
Hi.
Because you mentioned women without men, I had this question in my mind, and this reference to the orchard that is also is in the movie.
Yes.
It just brought it to my mind. Is there some kind of symbolism for both of you? The question is for both of you guys, actually. Is there some kind of symbolism that you are using the orchard aside from your memories from the childhood?
Well, you know, when I was writing the novel, when I was sort of structuring it, I used food, dress, and architecture as ways to construct a world. And in Iran, especially outside of the cities, orchards are very common. Because in Iran there's a very distinct difference between personal space, like indoor space, and then public space. So, orchards were very common. So the idea of like having this sort of self-contained world where this family lived, I wanted to build this world because, I mean, a novel, is like a film, is a world that you build, and you have to be true to the specificity of the place. So the orchard made perfect sense, as opposed to like a house, because in a city. I was trying to get at something that's very much Persian, which is the garden.
For me, I've been very interested in the place of garden and orchard in history of mysticism and Iranian literature, and it's always been a metaphor of a place for freedom and to be drunken, and I think in The Woman Without Men, what I loved about that book was that the orchard became an oasis, a sanctuary for the woman who ran away from the realism of the world and that what happened in that orchard was unworldly and that had this completely sort of existential and fantastically out of the world situation. And so for me it has a very deep metaphoric meaning that sort of directly hits back to tradition of Persian Islamic literature that interests me a lot.
I don't know how I'm going to say this, because I am accidentally here. I was very ambivalent to come. I know so little about the country, the history, the culture, and it's sometimes difficult. It's so foreigner, so far away from where I came. But listen your words and seeing you, there is an universality in this human experience. And I felt it so much part of myself and my own history.
May I ask where you're from?
I was born in Chile.
Chile, yes.
And I think it was a pleasure to hear your writing. And especially, I think that I know that you try to be very objective, but your lived experience is so clear that make much beautiful what I heard, and I appreciate that.
Thank you. Thank you.
It's a very shy audience.
There's a fantastic documentary called Nostalgia for the Light.
There's one
by Patricio Guzman. It's about Chile, and it's really, if any of you if you haven't seen it and you get a chance, please see it. He made this documentary about the disappeared. I mean, there's a desert, an Atacama Desert in Chile, where it's like the highest point, so they have this like telescope. It's like the most powerful telescope. So this film is about searching for our future, which is in space, and also these women in Chile who are searching for the remains of the disappeared in that desert, which under Pinochet, they were prisons. And that film had a really profound effect on me in the work that I do. It was really wonderful. We have very similar histories.
We have one more question.
Hi. Earlier, it was mentioned that a main goal of art is to be universal and be available for people to connect to. And after hearing this woman speak, I was wondering if, as an artist, how you approach that and how you make your art accessible and universal to people, or if that's a goal that you guys have in mind as you're creating your art, or if it kind of just happens on its own.
I think it's funny because we were talking about this. It's a really good question. We were talking about this in the conference room right before. I think what happens is that the more specific you are, the more true you are to the characters, the more universal it can become, because the things that people deal with, they're the same the world over. We wear different clothes, we have different architecture, we have different religions and languages and histories and all that, but we're the same species. So I think that any family anywhere, it's at one point they have those kinds of, those are things from, time immemorial, all of the, so I mean, when I was working, I was trying to be true to the characters in their own time and place, and hope that that has the capacity to sort of break out from its own specificity. Yeah.
I mean, for me, maybe I stop. Maybe there's more questions I shouldn't say. Let's.
Hello. Hello. That was a great talk, and I haven't read the book. I sort of follow Iran. I've lived in Turkey for the last 35 years. My question is, because I know Turkey and Iran are very different, and what has happened in Turkey is very different from what happened in Iran in '79, but there's the same division of society that's going on, and I'm wondering if in writing this you got any feeling for whether those wounds can ever be healed, or has this divided society permanently?
I don't know if I could speak to that with any kind of authority, because I don't live in Iran anymore. But I do know one thing that I think is true, and that is that most societies, if they're left alone, they figure out their own things. I think a lot of the trouble that Iran has is a lot of antagonism from the outside, which doesn't help. Revolutions, I don't think revolutions aren't over overnight. They take time. A people who want, to determine their own futures, it takes time, sometimes generations. And, interestingly enough, February 11th is the 40th anniversary of the revolution. And it seems like a lifetime to us because our human lives are short, but in terms of history, it's just a blip. This is a country with over 3,000 years of history. It's survived a lot worse, and it will come together again. Yeah.
Thank you so much for what you've shared so far. I'm really moved and touched by your candidness. I'm interested to know in how you craft your work in making the fabric of this gorgeous text. What are the threads that you've pulled away that are beginning to form into something new?
You mean like in terms of like the technical ways in which you?
It's connected to that, but rather in making choices of what you chose to curate into this piece of writing. What are the threads that you thought, actually, it doesn't belong to this book? These are the beginnings of something else.
There were things that I removed. And I think what helps in terms of, because I mean, when you write a story, you have 1,000 different choices that you can make. And I think what helps is to really, at least in this particular kind of writing, this particular type of story that I told, I think it's important to understand your characters, to understand them and to make choices that are true to them, that make sense for them. And, but it's like anything else, it's like when you put a film together, you need a set, you need lighting, you need camera, you need all these different components. And it's the same thing with a novel. You're creating a world. So you need where is this taking place? So you have to have the space, and who are these people, and is there going to be enough dramatic, tension? And okay, I'm going to use this historical moment as sort of the linchpin into what pulls this story forward, and then framed it into One Day in Paris, because that kind of pushes it all in. So those were the ways in which I kind of looked at it. But first I just wrote it. And I didn't really think about those things. I just wrote it. And then I came back and, and also, you start working with with an editor who comes in with big scissors. No, it was, it was a wonderful experience. So that's really, I hope that answers, does that?
Yeah, because one way to answer my question, I'm also interested in through whether through the editing or through your own curatorial choices, is there another book that's starting to take shape from the things that choices that you made for the things that you didn't include in this world you were crafting? Are there things that you've gone, actually, there's the beginnings of another world?
Yes, there is a possibility that I'm taking one of the characters into the next novel. And I'm pretty much sure that the next novel that I write will be in New York City, because this is where I'm from. I've lived in this city since 1981, so in a way, I'm, or as my friend says, "Wow, you're OG." I'm like, yes, I am original gangster. And so I think the next one, but I think that I'll always bring in some element of the Iranian experience in the form of certain characters or certain situations, because it's something that I know, and But yes, New York is the next. And I'm taking some of Neshapur in there with me to there.
I have a bit of a different kind of question. I'm wondering about, you've been in the arts for some time apparently, and I'm wondering about your experience, the delicateness of creation in the face of the kind of blaring spotlight that is on artists these days because of social media, because of the internet, because of the globalization of opinionation, if that's, I'm coining that. That everybody has an opinion and everyone can be heard, and I see so many artists getting lashed out so hard by people who aren't informed or don't understand the perspective they're coming from. And I'm just sort of wondering about your process as a creator, going through the delicate nature of bringing a story forward in the face of that harsh spotlight.
Well, the interesting thing is that I was really, really lucky, because when I was writing this novel, nobody cared. Like, nobody even, nobody knew. I kind of did this, quietly in the corner kind of thing. And, so I was very, very lucky in that I didn't have any of that to worry about. It was, it was just the people in my family and friends and stuff that were kind of aware that I was working on this thing. And one of the things, I'm on social media, I'm on Twitter, I'm on Facebook and Instagram. I'm, always posting things about the book and all of this stuff. And honestly, nothing terrible has happened yet, but I have made a concerted effort to sort of disconnect myself personally from the book. Like, this is done. I did what I needed to do. This is going to go out into the world, and people will think whatever they want, and they will say whatever they want, and it's not my problem. If they come at me, or if there's I don't know. In fact, I think this is a question you can answer better, because you have been working under the spotlight for many years, and you probably know how to navigate it better.
The only advice I got once, which was really great, is that never take praise too seriously and never take criticism too seriously. Mm-hmm. And I've been criticized on all sides. I've had Westerners who look at my work because of its cultural, connotations, and not looking at it from artistic point of view. And then I've had Iranian people who cannot separate themselves from the political issues that is embedded in the work. Therefore, it gets reduced to judgments. And so there's always a fight on my side to really defend the work for its premise as an artwork and not. But I do also am a person whose work is always delving into socio-political, historical issues of my country. So I've asked for it. I could have been painting flowers. And so I get, but what's really interesting, and I warn you because she's right, this is officially the first event related to this book. Next is going to be reviews and Iranian people coming saying, that's not how Iran was, or somebody is going to love it. But I tell you, I think the character of artists is really important, and the vulnerability of the artist, which is a fundamental part of being an artist. And that, look, we're not making masterpieces and we're not gods. This is an expression of our experience, our experiences on this world. And I'm sorry that if you don't share the same taste or the same view, or it's not about pleasing you, it's just a work, And then once you pass that, it still really hurts when people, I've had people stand up in a room like this and just grill me. But then over the time you also learn to stand up for yourself and also not be afraid of criticism. And I think this is something that I feel over the years I've been beaten up a lot, but it's made me a stronger artist in my head, not in my work. But in terms of understanding that I will never, ever be able to please everyone. Yeah. And that's okay. But you seem to have pleased a lot of people already in this room. I envy you. Is there other questions? I think we have a little bit more time. We have another 10 minutes or so. I think we end, Rachel, at 8. Yeah, of course.
Oh, I was watching. Sorry.
Introduce who she
I was
is.
watching Roma over the break, just like such a profoundly moving movie. I think it's like the best thing I've seen in 10 years. And I was reminded of your book in that it's this family in Mexico City. Most of the book takes place in this house, in the world of the house, and you get to know everyone so well. And there is like political strife in it. There's young men who become weaponized and violent within the family, and it's not, the parallels are not exact, but as we were talking about how universal that expression of families and political unrest and how we deal with each other, and also the life of servants who live with us. And so this might be self-serving what I'm trying to say, but you said you began as a screenplay and you went into a novel. Could we go back to another screenplay? Because I just feel like this movie is already so visual. I would love to see it as a movie. This is a shameless plug, not for the sales of the book, but because I really do.
Editor Lee Newman.
Yeah, I do feel like it would make a wonderful movie.
No, I would be happy for this to be a film. Yeah, I think. Yeah. The agent is working on it. But no, I think it can. It originally was a film, and I think having it turned into a novel and then turned back into a screenplay. Cormac McCarthy originally wrote No Country for Old Men as a screenplay. Then he turned it into a novel, and then the Coen brothers turned it into a screenplay. So if it works for me, it'll work for me too. The Coen brothers want to make to keep the sun alive. Well, no, but
I don't want to see them make it.
This would be good for that.
I have a question, and you kind of allude to it in the sections you read, but I'd like to hear you say a little bit more. To keep the sun alive. Could you talk about the title? And I can think of various meanings from it. So I'm really curious to hear you say.
Well, one of them I came across in my research in the description of Chaharshanbe Suri, which is the last Wednesday before the Persian New Year, which is the first day of spring, and this is a Zoroastrian tradition where a fire is lit, and people jump over the fire, and there's sayings that they say, like, take the yellow from my skin, give me the red. It's sort of like about rejuvenation and rebirth for spring. And this fire is lit from the time the sun goes down, and it's kept lit until it rises to keep the sun alive. And so I saw that, and I thought, and I really loved that phrase. And I thought that it can mean many things.
The illusion, talking about the eclipse,
yes,
makes another obvious, and then the idea that culture is in some way keeping the sun alive.
Yeah.
It
true.
just had all these layers.
It has all of these layers. It has all of these, and also, to keep the sun alive could be about storytelling. It could be about. It could be so many different things. So I thought that's a good title. I think it'll work. There were some other ones that shall remain unknown.
Please keep the sun alive.
Please keep it alive. Yes.
Do we have any other questions? Oh. Let's have one last question in the back, and then actually you'll have a chance to talk to Rabi and get your book signed.
Hi.
Hello.
I haven't read your book, but you made several references to the Zoroastrian sort of mingling with the culture of the Persians. Is that sort of described in more detail in your book, or could you talk a little bit more about that? Because that's a very interesting part. I'm originally from Pakistan, but I have insight into the Iranian culture, but I've never had a deeper sort of insight into the Zoroastrian and the Persian culture sort of intermixing.
Well, Zoroastrianism, the only place that I kind of bring it up in the novel is from the Chahar-Sham Suri, because it's a pre-Islamic religion in Iran. It's monotheistic. It's the prophet Zoroaster, so it's the pre-Islamic faith of Iranians, and all of their beliefs and traditions have become cultural traditions. There are Zoroastrians in Iran. There's I think a few thousand Zoroastrians left in Iran, and the Parsis in India are Zoroastrian. I think they have the fire. They have the fire still lit.
In Iran too,
in Shiraz. And, one of the reasons that I found that thing interesting is the year that I was in Iran was the year when the two calendars overlapped. And it was, and Ashura fell on Chahar-Sham Suri. And boy, oh boy, things got interesting in the streets. Because you had this clash of these two identities. And I've always found that really interesting because it is two sort of opposing identities in many ways. I read this wonderful memoir by Ramin Jahanbegloo, who's an Iranian philosopher. And he wrote this description I told you in the conference room. He described Iranians as having three personalities, so to speak: a prehistoric national pride, a Shiite fatalism, and a hedonistic individualism. And these three things are always fighting with one another. And that always seemed really interesting to me because I think that Iran's culture, its history is so long and so much has happened, and there's always these ways of coming up against each other. But yeah, I don't know if I answered your question, but okay.
I think we're out of time.
Yeah. So I think we're going to stop here for the moment. We do have the books, and you also have an opportunity. But please join me in giving a big hand to Rabeah and Shirin.
Thank you.
And this is a conversation that I know will continue. So thank you all for coming tonight, and look forward to seeing you again.